These Viet Cong are elusive. You can't see them. All you can do is hear the bullets as they come at you.
This is an enemy which steals from us the weapons of the 20th century and supplements them with the weapons of the 16th century.
Exercise great care. Every object is a possible booby trap. Some booby traps are more alluring and ingenious than others. If you are a boob, you will be trapped.
The biggest problem in fighting the enemy in Vietnam is finding him in order to fight him. The Americans could have learned something from Vietnam. Using the conflict as a lesson, American planners could have used as precedent the futility of using such metrics as body counts and firepower, tonnage of bombs to measure success in war. Of course, even before the end of the war, American planners knew that bombing wouldn't win the war. Defense Secretary Clark Clifford admitted as much in 1969. Bombing by itself would not stop the war. We had already dropped a heavier tonnage of bombs than in all the theaters of World War II. During 1967, an estimated 90,000 North Vietnamese had infiltrated into South Vietnam. In the opening weeks of 1968, infiltrators were coming in at 3 to 4 times the rate of a year earlier, despite the ferocity and intensity of our bombing campaign. Despite this, heavy firepower continued to be the grand strategy for all future American wars, the success of which would vary between ambiguous and outright catastrophic. Iraq and Afghanistan are no exception. Iraq, as I covered in my Iraq insurgency video, proved to have a boundless will to resist. And despite clobbering the country with unrelenting firepower, the Iraqis were never subdued, the Americans' goals were never met, and the Iraq fiasco proved to be a massive and costly failure. The cleverness of the Iraqis also knew no bounds, who had no army to speak of by April of 2003, no navy, no air force, no helicopters, and by arming themselves with simple assault rifles, machine guns, rockets, and mortars, and by utilizing scraps of metal and electronics, they were able to outfit themselves into a formidable force, against all the odds stacked against them. Iraq was guerrilla war, as was Vietnam. In Robert Asprey's mammoth history of guerrilla warfare, the author describes the mentality that the Americans were operating from. Quote, "Not understanding basic tenets of guerrilla warfare, American senior officers converted fatalities into victories. This was a great mistake. Dead bodies do not mean destroyed infrastructure. Dead bodies, particularly those of innocent peasants, mean a strengthening, not a weakening, of the insurgent cause." The colonial enemy of the Iraqis were the British, in Vietnam, the French. In their pacification campaign, the French arrested nationalist leaders and executed them via guillotine, even displaying their severed heads publicly to terrorize would-be revolutionaries. Many were imprisoned and shipped off to Cun Dao, a prison that would be maintained through the American occupation and would come to have a brutal reputation. Those imprisoned at Cun Dao would form the early foundation of the communist revolutionary movement and included multiple future prime ministers. When the United States took over from the French in 1954, they, as had happened in Iraq nearly 50 years later, would make a series of blunderous errors that by all means created a guerrilla army that took up arms to fight them. After the French were defeated on the battlefield, a Geneva conference split Vietnam in two and created the country of South Vietnam. It is no exaggeration to say that the country of South Vietnam was a creation of the United States. The US would even handpick an exile named Ngo Dinh Diem and import him directly from the United States. Despite the Geneva Conference's guidelines for a national election to be held in 1956, Diem and his American handlers blocked democratic elections. And with the introduction of such laws as the Public Meetings Law, which banned assembly, and the Bill for the Protection of Morality, effectively banning free speech and causing total censorship of press, Diem was now a full-fledged dictator. In 1963, Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge would express his dismay at the inefficiency of Diem's internal police service. Vietnam is not a thoroughly strong police state because, unlike Hitler's Germany, it is not efficient. But don't think the American involvement was merely at an advisory level. Diem's special police was secretly managed by the CIA, who did so through a contract with Michigan State University. Beginning in 1955, MSU spent $15 million of U.S. taxpayer money building up South Vietnam's security services. In 1959, Diem passed the 1059 Edict, which made, quote, infringements on the national security punishable by death with no appeal. By year's end, Diem and his secret police had imprisoned 50,000 people. Diem's forces would embark on expeditions in the South in order to round up communist sympathizers, and namely the Viet Minh. These expeditions were very, very violent, and between 1957 and 1961, nearly 70,000 people were killed, giving Diem's secret police the fair categorization of a Latin American-style death squad. John F. Kennedy saw a huge escalation of the war, authorizing napalm, chemical weapons, and in violation of troop limits set at Geneva, thousands of new so-called advisors, and by 1962, there were nearly 12,000 US troops in the country. The escalation was part of an effort to drive scores of Vietnamese into concentration camps, or what the US military and to this day many historians and journalists call strategic hamlets. The program had already been tried under Diem, who, along with his many other failed ventures, had forcibly transferred 200,000 people into these camps. With America's help, that number would jump to over 8 million. Upon arrival, civilians were made to dig ditches and wrap barbed wire around the perimeter of the camps, and build a wall of sharpened bamboo stakes. All this ostensibly to protect the villagers from the resistance, who many of them supported. And by forcibly uprooting the people from their ancestral homes, the program also created scores of new insurgents. A report on a strategic hamlet from the U.S. General Accounting Office concluded, during our inspection, we observed there were no latrines, no usable wells, no classrooms, and no medical facilities. The shelters were crudely constructed from a variety of waste material, such as empty ammunition boxes and cardboard. The American Refugee Advisor stated that there were no plans to improve the living conditions at this site. The violent expeditions undertaken by the US and South Vietnamese government, as with the cordon and sweep operations and raids in Iraq, did major damage to their own cause. The same can be said for mass imprisonment, and in the case of Vietnam, outright internment, all leading up to the creation of a mysterious ragtag group of nationalists. As the Viet Minh sought to expel the French, these ambitious figures sought to defeat the Diemist forces, and ultimately the United States, who in their eyes were merely colonists by another name. The so-called strategic hamlets became a despised symbol of the Diem regime, and were targeted for attack by guerrillas, their prisoners freed. Leading the charge was a group calling itself the National Liberation Front, and by dismantling the camps, which by 1963 held 67% of the rural population, the NLF were making serious gains, and were approaching majority control of the countryside. The NLF, what the Western press refers to as the Viet Cong, initially sought a nonviolent political strategy, but following the introduction of Diem's concentration camps and 1059 Edict, the guerrillas mounted an organized, widespread, and popularly supported rebellion. The NLF's Liberation Army was organized into two principal groups of combatants, a main force organized into companies and battalions in standard army fashion, and irregular paramilitaries. These local forces were farmers by day and guerrillas by night, and engaged in combat whenever they had a military advantage. The guerrilla farmers were the pool from which assassination teams, volunteer grenade throwers, and saboteurs were drawn. In order to seize and then control territory, that territory's administration had to be replaced by the administration of the NLF, and the way to do that was to liquidate them. Targeting the state-appointed village chiefs, the insurgency killed an estimated 4,000 from 1960 to 1961 alone. A captured military document tells fighters to, quote, carry out assassination missions right at the center to immobilize the enemy. Prime targets should be security forces and civil action district officials, hooligans, and thugs. After working tirelessly to peel the lid off the insurgency and embarrassing the United States with his suppression of Buddhists, Diem was finally seen as too costly to keep around. So, with the authorization of Ambassador Lodge, Diem was shot and then stabbed in the heart by a military assassin inside of a car. By then, the NLF controlled most of the countryside, and they showed no sign of slowing down. They ambushed and attacked South Vietnamese military and police outposts, and seized their American weapons, which, as we'll see, they were becoming heavily armed with. And it wasn't only outposts either. By 1964, the Liberation Army had become capable of wiping out entire units of Saigon troops, or about 100 men. But it wasn't often that they were able to take out entire battalions, which numbered between 500 and 700 troops. Nevertheless, in 1964, they managed to wipe out 8 of them. Toward the end of the year, the fighting escalated when NLF forces commenced a series of attacks on Saigon troops, and in December, they would wipe out 2.5 battalions out of just 11 in the Strategic Reserves, an elite U.S.-trained force, which by 1965 had virtually ceased to exist. The garrisons manning the small outposts and watchtowers fled in fear, and the ones that did remain were spared by supplying arms to the guerrillas. A standard price for a month's survival was 10,000 rounds of ammunition a month. As in Iraq, Vietnam became overflowing with weaponry. But not from the weapons depots that were already there. It was the Americans who were supplying their enemy. Wilfred Burchett, who lived among Vietnamese communists in South Vietnam for 6 months during the war, described in detail the degree to which the Americans were supplying them. When one looked at a regular soldier of the front, the extent of U.S. gifts became even more impressive. His standard arm is the U.S. carbine, but a percentage of his comrades in arms will be carrying Garands, Tommy guns, 37mm machine guns, a variety of bazookas and mortars, and in battalion-size units, a few of the highly appreciated 57mm recoilless cannon. Indeed, Lyndon B. Johnson's massive escalation of the war and the subsequent increase in military equipment and arms only made the problem worse. America's guys, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN, and the Government of Vietnam, or GVN, were some of the biggest sources of their arms. And by selling them off to make personal fortunes, the South Vietnamese government was furnishing the communists with more weapons than were arriving from Hanoi. In 1965, Lyndon Johnson authorized a surge of hundreds of thousands of troops, which would peak at over 500,000 by 1968. With more U.S. troops came more U.S. casualties, and in 1966, already over 6,000 Americans were killed. The Liberation Forces had the advantage of a vast network of spies and extensive popular support from the rural population. They were also in their native territory. Marine Captain John G. Miller would recount some of the challenges faced by Americans in Vietnam. The constant heavy rains of the wet monsoon can swell rifle stocks to the point where the trigger cannot be depressed completely, and where disassembly and assembly are out of the question. Rust and corrosion of metal surfaces are, of course, accompanying side effects. Their heavy gear was also a huge setback. A Marine wearing a flak jacket will not match the cross-country speed of a guerrilla who is not wearing one. Captain Francis West of the 9th Marines would agree. Each rifleman carried 150 rounds of ammunition and 2 or more hand grenades. The men of the 2 machine gun crews were strapped with belts of linked cartridges totaling 1,200 rounds. The platoon moved out at 1100. There was no breeze and no shade. The temperature was 102 degrees Fahrenheit. Within 5 minutes, every Marine was soaked in sweat. Soldiers were no doubt scared, ill-equipped to fight an enemy who vanished into thin air when confronted. Jungle shadows. It didn't help that the NLF had created a whole life underground, building extremely impressive networks of tunnels, with some containing kitchens, with dispersed horizontal ventilation tunnels leading some distance away in order to avoid detection from aircraft. Many tunnels were reinforced and sealed with concrete. Some even opened up underneath streams or canals. The base area at Cu Chi contained nearly 200 miles of tunnels. There were storage rooms for weapons or rice, or even small clinics. Tunnels near the surface led up to hundreds of firing posts. Wilfred Burchett, the Western journalist who lived with the NLF, described some of these firing posts. I was taken to inspect a single clump of bamboo and told to look very carefully for anything suspicious among the roots. I found nothing. Then I was taken into the tunnel and to a firing position which could accommodate 3 or 4 people. Someone took a stick and poked it through what seemed to be blind slits with earthen gun rests behind them. Impossible for anyone to detect at even a few yards. Other firing positions which I inspected were also perfectly camouflaged, and as the guerrillas changed places constantly, even if the gun flash or smoke gave a position away, it would be little use firing at it. Indeed, Burchett was with the Liberation Army while they engaged in a firefight with enemy forces. The guerrillas fired, then rushed to positions parallel to the line of flight and fired again, moving with incredible speed through the undergrowth and firing all the time. No amount of American assistance in Indochina can conquer an enemy which is everywhere and at the same time nowhere. An enemy of the people, which has the sympathy and support of the people. Since the liberation forces were so elusive, many US troops were put in the uncomfortable position of leading with their chins, which is exactly what the guerrillas wanted them to do. They'd react in one of a few ways, including leading them on a wild goose chase and ambushing them. Indeed, ambushes with small arms fire accounted for many deaths of GIs. But there were other concerns, namely booby traps. Made by NLF troops and even villagers, but pioneered by the minority tribes of Vietnam such as the Kor, Manang, and Ede, these death traps have become a hallmark of the war in Vietnam, much like the IEDs from Iraq. Trapdoors on trails led to a bed of bamboo punji spikes. Spiked beams swung from door frames, and giant flying medieval-style maces, made by stuffing clay into a basket with spikes sticking out of it, were just some of their creative undertakings. These weapons are legendary, and like the IEDs of Iraq, a huge blow to morale, since their distribution and ubiquity could only mean one thing, that they were made with the full knowledge and even support of much of the population. Indigenous tribes also used homemade crossbows, shooting poisoned arrows which paralyzed and killed, spreading terror amongst the South Vietnamese forces. One particularly gnarly invention, as observed by Wilfred Burchett, was the spiking of rice paddies in order to target marauding government troops. The spikes are set in rigid lengths of bamboo and planted deep in the rice field slush. Wounds inflicted in the rice field slush were particularly serious because of the human and pig excrement lavishly used as manure. Amputations were almost the only answer to infections from such wounds. A rough way of fighting, one may well comment, but so was the attempt to starve out the tribal people by destroying their food crops. But IEDs aren't just a relic of Iraq, they were used liberally in Vietnam as well. By rigging mines to explode via tripwires or electronic detonation, IEDs were among the most deadly and effective weapons against the American occupation. In fact, the first US soldier killed in action in Vietnam was hit by an anti-personnel mine. As in Korea, flooding the country with landmines proved to have a disastrous blowback effect which killed scores of Americans. In fact, mines would account for 33% of all US casualties in Vietnam, along with 28% of deaths. Individual units suffered even greater losses. The 1st Marine Division reported that 57% of their casualties were from mines and booby traps during the latter half of 1968. In 1967, mines and booby traps caused 4,300 US casualties. In 1968, that number jumped to 5,800. We suspect that the figures attributed to mines are low. It is probable that the classification of fragmentation casualties, which we have not counted, contains the results of many mines and booby trap incidents. Several divisions have reported, for example, that about half of their hostile casualties are inflicted by mines and booby traps. On August 6, 1970, Gordon Weiss would feel the sting of an anti-personnel mine on a routine patrol, writing in a letter to his family, quote, "Assumed you'd heard what happened to me. To make matters short, I was walking point for my platoon, somewhere around 10 in the morning. I hit a booby trap. It was a pressure release type mine, therefore it was easily camouflaged and rough to spot. I lost most of my left leg and my left hand. I'll write when I have the chance." Weiss wouldn't get the chance. He died 2 days later from his injuries. We kill more Americans with our own mines than we do anyone else. And the Pentagon knew this for years. By 1969, the Pentagon admitted, at least internally, that most mines were American-made. The enemy uses a very limited number of Soviet and Chinese communist mines. The majority are fabricated locally in village or district munition factories from US duds and refuse. 90% of all mine and booby trap components are US origin. Indeed, on any given year, American bombing could leave behind more than 20,000 tons of unexploded ordnance. And after these air raids, volunteers could retrieve these bombs and begin the dangerous process of creating booby traps with them. One stop in Wilfred Burchett's journey with the Vietnamese communists was a fully functioning bomb factory. Laboratories housed bamboo huts lined with US parachute nylon. Girls with delicate balances were weighing the minuscule quantities of explosives necessary for various types of detonator caps. Lathes, generators, boring and polishing machines, all of them American, were in underground dugouts. Before being killed by a landmine himself, Gordon Weiss eerily described life in the mine-infested jungle. Mines are a horrible, senseless device that do nothing more than slow us down. We'd rather take on 1,000 in a firefight than have to walk through a known minefield. In what exact ways have we advanced toward peace? The war, as we know it, is still going on. Replacements are still being sent to Vietnam. We are still suffering about 750 casualties a week. And the war is still costing the American people about $70 million a day. What could the Vietnam War have taught American planners if they had chosen to heed its warning? It seems clear that time and time again, saturation bombing is wholly ineffective at subduing an insurgency. Rounding up and interning them doesn't seem to make any difference either. In fact, it only appears to enrage and embolden them. An audit of the war, by its numbers, again paints the portrait of a complete failure of America's core goals. According to official American military estimates, there were 134,000 communist regulars and guerrillas in the South at the end of 1965. By 1967, that number may have been as high as 280,000, but the CIA believed the actual figure was much higher, at over 500,000 by 1968. So, rather, the bombing and internment seemed to have the diametric opposite effect. And yet massive and disproportionate firepower and mass detention without trial continued apace. Since there is no logic, perhaps American planners operate on an illogical basis and are surrounded by mentally deranged cronies and ghouls. Well, they are, but there is a logic to what they do. Using contractors to maintain, guard, and staff prisons, buying all of these thousands of tons of ordnance, does serve a purpose: to enrich a ghoulish sector of the economy that is in ecstasy at the thought of a massive air war against a defenseless population. And many in the industry actively participate in waging public campaigns in order to garner support to launch more of them. These wars, as costly as they are to the United States, enrich private industries, all the while subverting America's prestige and global hegemony. In any case, if American planners will not use the example of Vietnam and Iraq, and Afghanistan and Korea, as lessons in order to save lives or even save themselves, citizens of the world, particularly those designated by the United States as state sponsors of terrorism or enemies, can use the lesson of the National Liberation Front. Despite the America's use of an auxiliary force, namely the South Vietnamese, and their vastly disproportionate technological edge, the Vietnamese were able to secure many, many enemy KIA, and ultimately win the war. As in Iraq, the resistance was so overwhelming against such an awesome occupying force that it should indeed be studied in insurgency and revolutionary circles for many years to come. I need your help. This channel relies on donations and patrons. Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video or you feel like you learned something, please consider subscribing. And if you want to support the channel further, just go to patreon.com/GDFofficial to become a patron. The link is in the description. And join the many different Discord servers. Everyone is really cool and we talk about video ideas all the time. It's a great community. I also accept donations via PayPal and Cash App. Those QR codes are on the screen now. Also, those links are in the description as well. I'd really appreciate any donations since YouTube hardly monetizes my videos, and it all goes to supporting the channel. Stay tuned for future videos about Iraq for my 20th anniversary series. Love you all. Thanks, and take care.